So, if you have been reading fast bikes over the past 7 months, you will know that I have been running this Kawasaki ZX-6R as my long-term test bike. And sadly for me, my time with it has come to an end. But lucky for someone else, it's now arrived at the Chris Walker Motorcycles showroom, where it's now going to be offered for sale to one lucky person who's going to take it on for the next chapter of its life. So, before I finally bid farewell and leave it here in the showroom, I thought I'd just grab 5 minutes and quickly run through, some of the things that I've really learnt about this bike and the ZX6 in particular. But first, I suppose it's probably worth just mentioning why I chose the ZX6. After all, it's a really old design that Kawasaki reintroduced for 2024, and it had been discontinued for a few years. And I suppose the main thing why I did that was I was really interested in bikes around this £10,000 price point. It's an area of the market that's ever increasing in popularity for good reason. And Kawasaki brought back the ZX6, much to everyone's surprise, and in doing so they had to make it Euro 5 Plus compatible. But I'll come on to that shortly, how they did that and how I got around it. The supersport sector has come in for a lot of flack recently, and with sports bikes now basically being reduced to 200 horsepower mega bikes with mega price tags, the arrival or re-arrival of a £10,000 sports bike, genuine bona fide sports bike, alloy frame, fully adjustable suspension, and a 4-cylinder supersport engine, it was something I just couldn't ignore. Now, I have definitely had a great time on this bike, there's no doubt about that, but I have actually been trying to learn some stuff about it in the meantime. I suppose in no particular order, I thought I'd just run through some of the key points. First of all, I did get to do a track day on this bike. As it is, no fancy, I just let a bit of air out of the tyres and went to Donington for a morning really. It rained in the afternoon, so I just took it home once it started raining. But the experience that you get riding this bike on track compared to a super bike is completely different. But the main thing to really note is that it's no less exhilarating. There's at no point during the course of the day on track or the afternoon on track did I wish I was on a litre bike. I was scaring the crap out of myself all too often. On this bike, you have to brake uncomfortably late. You have to roll into the corner uncomfortably quickly, and you have to get back on the gas uncomfortably earlier. Whereas, on a litre bike, the thrill comes from a different experience where you're feel like a bit of a passenger on the bike and you're trying to tame a beast. It's completely the opposite with this. You have to ride it in such a way that it's a real challenge, and you have to keep the speed up. And I had this day on track with it, and it was really the main point to note was that just because it didn't have a couple of hundred horsepower at the time, in fact it was completely standard at the time, so it was only making 108 horsepower. But yeah, it was a thoroughly satisfying day, no less satisfying, no less thrilling, and no less adrenaline packed than it would have been on a litre bike. It's just via a different way, really. So yeah, on track, absolutely mega. So the next point I want to move on to is how Kawasaki were able to reintroduce it back into the market by bringing it up to the Euro 5 emissions standards, which are really, really tough compared to what this was previously. Basically, the short version is I fitted the exhaust system to it and the Arrow system to it and took it to MSS Performance, thinking that it was just probably all Kawasaki had done was stick another catalytic converter into the exhaust. And in fact, it's much more cleverer than that and actually a lot easier to undo. We put this system on anyway and took our measurements, but the guys at MSS told me that this new spec ZX6, compared to the one that was discontinued, has got a set of ride-by-wire throttle butterflies, a secondary set of butterflies, which is controlled by the ECU. So what the upshot of that means is that when you're at most RPM, especially at high RPM, at full throttle, depending on what RPM you're at, you can be getting as little as 40% opening on the butterflies. So as you go up the RPM on full gas, the butterflies underneath you are basically gradually closing and closing and closing until you're at full throttle, but the actual throttles are nowhere near it. And that's how they kind of dodged around it. So What happened, what we did is we fitted the exhaust system to it, and that was great. That released some power and helped the engine breathe a lot better, obviously. But what they were also able to do while they were in the ECU, mapping for the new exhaust, letting more fuel in and playing with the ignition timing, they were also able to set those throttle butterflies to match the throttle twist grip exactly. So it's called a 1-to-1 ratio. So basically, if you're at 100% throttle out here in your hand, the butterflies are also at 100% all the time. If you're at 60%, you get 60%. And the difference that makes to how the bike feels and reacts in your hand on the road was literally day and night. If you've got one of these latest generation ZX6s, if you do nothing else to it, I do strongly recommend taking it to a performance centre and get them to reset the throttle bodies so that they match the throttle twist grip. And then of course, if you can put a exhaust system on, all the better. For some pub ammo, the bike as it was standard as it came to me when we measured it first before we did anything to it was 108 horsepower. With the exhaust and all the modifications to the mapping and the throttle bodies and the ignition, it went up to 116 horsepower. And then when I put some ram air directly into its nose, that added another 10 horsepower. The ram air apparently is about between 100 and 120 miles an hour effective wind speed. As well as the extra gain in horsepower at the peak, it was throughout the whole rev range. That boost in power was from all the way from the bottom third of the rev range right up to the rev limiter. But more than that, just how the bike felt in your hand with those throttle bodies reacting exactly as your twist grip was, transformed the bike. So if you've got one of these, do that. Let's talk about the electronics briefly. So this ties into how Kawasaki are able to keep the bike at the price point it is, which, as I speak to you, is £10,500. What Kawasaki have been able to do and able to hit that price point, if you think about it, this is actually quite an old design, as in it's been around for a long time. It's had a few tweaks along the way here and there, but essentially you can trace this all the way back. Well, you can actually go back to pretty much 15 years with this design. And what that means is all their tooling costs and all their R&D costs have already been paid for. So rather than come up with a new model for the supersport sector, like for example Yamaha have done with the R9 recently, you know, they've just been able to bring back a bike that's effectively already paid for itself, and without doing anything to it, they can go in at that price point. What that does mean though is it does mean stuff like the electronics on it are pretty crude. There's not much to choose from and there's no real adjustability. But I'm kind of okay with that because I keep going back to this price point. Would I rather a full set of rider aids, fully adjustable and a ton of stuff to choose from on a 100 horsepower motorbike, or this thing at 10 grand? For me, it's a no-brainer. And if I'm being honest, I just switched it all off anyway. There is a rider mode within the menu that you can go in and you can set the traction control off and you have power on to full. You have to have ABS, you can't switch that off. And that's how the bike has lived with me since day one. So I kind of switched it all off anyway. So I'm okay with that. It's surprisingly versatile. So this is the next thing. I'm 6'3", 6'4", somewhere in that region. I'm obviously a bit of a unit. It's a small bike, but it has actually got quite a big riding position. You know, on the motorway, you can get probably about 140, 150 miles out of a tank of fuel, and I can do that in one sitting, and I'm still, well, I'm ready to get off it at that point, don't get me wrong, but I'm not screaming out in agony as I might be as I have been on other bigger bikes. And that's probably one of the interesting things. So don't dismiss this bike because it's a small 600. It is a small bike, but it has quite a good size riding position. And it's also, as I've just touched on, you know, doing the mundane stuff like trundling down motorways for a couple of hours. You know, it's fine at that. It's a nice place to be. Obviously scratching around your local A roads and B roads, as I said earlier, track days, there's plenty of room on the seat and the handlebars are high enough. You can really throw yourself around in the riding position and get into all the right places where you want to be to really dive into the bike's handling. So surprisingly versatile for a bike that's so track focused. So really the main key point I want to just make there is don't dismiss this bike because it is a proper focused supersport bike. And then the final point, really, just to wrap up really ZX6 and my time on it, is really, I've kind of touched on it already, it's this kind of less is more experience that you get with it. So it's not really any sort of technical key point on the bike or piece of equipment. It's really just the type of experience you have on this bike being so different to what you might have on a litre bike. You know, this is a back to basics bike. There's no frills on this thing. It's all about the riding experience. And you know, getting it up there in that top half, top third of the rev range, keeping your momentum up, timing your gear changes just right. You know, it's a wonderful thing to do. And when you get this bike singing, which isn't difficult, I might add, because it's not obviously a 600cc engine. There's a good amount of flexibility in that engine, especially with all the electronics tidied up, as I just said. So, you know, when you ride one of these bikes, you're not getting a full full fat experience with loads of bragging rights. That, you know, you can't ride to the pub on this bike and win any kind of top trumps bragging rights games, because it probably won't make as much power as anyone else's bike, and it certainly won't have as many toys and so on and so forth. But what it does do is it lets you, for me anyway, it kind of reminded me and reconnected me with my younger self when I was hacking around my local roads and just enjoying the pure joy of motorcycling and thrashing around on a bike. From my 20s, when I was doing that kind of thing in my 20s, it made me feel 20 years old again, you know, which was a long time ago. And so anything or anyone that can do that gets a big thumbs up from me. So I guess all that's left to say really about the ZX6 is I will be really, really sad to see it go. Whoever gets this bike in particular is getting one that's got obviously the full Arrow exhaust system on it and all the mapping done, and I've set the suspension up on it to how I like it, but take that as it is. But what's good about this bike is it's restarted that whole supersport sector. It's joined in that fight. And I don't know how many of these Kawasaki have sold, but however many it is, I'm certain everyone who's bought one this year will have enjoyed it as much as I have. So all that's left to say is thank you, Kawasaki, for lending me this bike for 7 months. And good luck to the person, whoever buys this bike from Chris Walker Motorcycles. And I really hope you have as much fun on this bike as I have.